Jake Morrison appeared like countless other cattlemen working their land in the fading twilight. Yet when the sharp crack of rifle fire shattered the evening calm across the mesa, couldn't foresee that sheltering one young Apache would draw 40 braves to his doorstep before sunrise. The gunfire originated from Devil's Gulch, bright and vicious against the peaceful dusk. Jake lifted his head from the fence rail he'd been repairing, his calloused palms still clutching the barbed wire. Those shots carried an ominous tone, too frequent, too clustered. Like hunters pursuing prey they meant to destroy. He brushed dust from his brow and strained to listen. Only desert wind whistling through the mesquite remained. Yet his instincts screamed danger. The same survival sense that had preserved him through to cattle wars and endless solitary nights in this unforgiving wilderness. Jake bridled his mare and headed toward the gulch, following a path carved by 15 seasons of checking his herd. The crimson sun dipped low, staining the canyon walls scarlet and creating lengthy shadows that could conceal anything or anyone. That's when he discovered the child, slight and bronze-skinned, perhaps 13 summers, huddled behind a sandstone outcrop beside the stream. Crimson seeped through his shredded tunic, and his obsidian eyes shifted between Jake and the ridges beyond, like a trapped creature calculating escape routes. Jake dismounted carefully, keeping his hands visible and empty. The youngster was clearly Apache, and judging by his nervous backward glances, those rifle shots had been intended for him. "Easy now, boy," Jake murmured softly. "How badly are you hit?" The child's jaw clenched, but he didn't flee. Couldn't flee. More accurately, blood spreading across his shirt told its own story, and his breathing came in shallow, agonized gasps. Distant hoofbeats grew nearer, men's voices thick with bloodlust. The kind of voices belonging to those who'd discovered sport in hunting the defenseless. "They're tracking you?" Jake inquired. A single nod. The boy's small hand pressed against his bleeding ribs. Jake reached his decision instantly. The way he'd made every crucial choice in his 47 years. Swift and decisive, without second-guessing. "Can you stay?" Mounted another nod. "Then we're leaving immediately." He lifted the child onto his horse, surprised by how fragile and light he felt, like an injured hawk. The boy gritted his teeth against the pain, remaining silent even as Jake settled him in the saddle. They rode hard toward Jake's homestead, the youngster gripping the saddle horn while Jake led the horse through treacherous terrain. Behind them, the voices grew more frustrated. They'd lost the trail. Jake's cabin nestled in a natural bowl between twin bluffs, concealed from the main trail and neighboring ranches. He'd constructed it that way deliberately, valuing solitude over accessibility. Tonight, that decision might preserve both their lives. Inside the dwelling, Jake struck a match and examined the boy's injury. A bullet furrow across the ribs, agonizing, but not lethal if kept clean. He worked silently, cleansing the wound with rot-gut whiskey and wrapping it with strips from a fresh undershirt. "Chatan," the boy whispered his first spoken words. "Well, Chatan, you're protected here for now." But even speaking those words, Jake realized safety was a privilege neither could guarantee. His closest neighbors were the Crawford clan, who'd gunned down an Apache for sport alone. And if news spread that he was hiding an Indian child, the thunder of approaching horses froze them both. Multiple mounts moving slowly and purposefully searching. Jake extinguished the flame and crept to the window, peering through a curtain gap. 6 riders sat just beyond his gate, their faces masked in shadow, but their purpose clear as mountain air. One called out, his voice carrying across the yard, like a challenge. "Morrison, we know you're inside. We're hunting something that escaped from us." Jake immediately recognized the speaker. Silas Garrett, the cruelest bastard in 4 counties, notorious for savagery that extended far beyond his treatment of animals. Beside him sat his brother Lucas, accompanied by 4 others Jake didn't know personally, though their breed was unmistakable. Drifters and killers who'd commit any atrocity for coin and the chance to shed blood. "Can't imagine how anything of yours ended up on my property, Garrett," Jake called through the barred door. "Unless you've lost some livestock." Silas's laughter was harsh and mirthless. "Drop the pretense, Morrison. We followed an Apache brat straight to your fence. Little Savage stabbed one of my boys before running. Jake glanced down at Chayton, who had gone statue still beside the window. The child's dark eyes held no terror now, only cold comprehension that his life depended on whatever transpired in the coming moments. Plenty of tracks out there, Jake replied. Could have headed anywhere after reaching my spread? Could have, but didn't. Lucas Garrett chimed in, his voice thinner than his brother's but twice as venomous. Saw you returning from Devil's Gulch less than an hour past? Mighty suspicious timing. Jake's mind raced. They'd been watching him, meaning this wasn't random pursuit. They'd planned this ambush, probably tracking the boy for hours before cornering him at the gulch. Now they knew exactly where he'd taken refuge. I'll make this simple, Morrison, Silas continued. Surrender the boy, and we'll forget you interfered. Keep protecting him, and we'll assume you're picking sides in a fight you can't win. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a branding fire. Jake had lived on this land long enough to understand that men like the Garrett brothers never made empty promises. They'd torch his home, stampede his cattle, and leave him buzzard. Food without losing sleep, but gazing down at Chayton. Sitting wounded and small on his floor, Jake felt something crystallize in his chest. The same sensation he'd experienced 25 years ago when he'd abandoned his uncle's slave plantation rather than own another human soul. Some boundaries couldn't be crossed, regardless of consequences. Don't know what you're referring to, he said finally. Haven't spotted any Apache children around these parts. The silence that followed was more threatening than any promise of violence. Jake could sense their rage building like steam in a boiler ready to explode. Have it your way, Silas said. But we'll be monitoring you, Morrison. That boy has to surface eventually, and when he does, we'll be waiting. Anyone sheltering him will answer for it. The horses departed, but Jake knew they hadn't gone far. They'd circle back, establish positions where they could observe his cabin unseen. This confrontation was far from over. It was just beginning. He turned to Chayton, who was struggling to rise despite his wound. Where do you think you're going? Cannot remain, the boy said, his English precise but accented. We'll bring death to your home. Death's already at my threshold, son. Has been since I chose not to bow to men like Garrett. Jake moved to his weapon rack and retrieved his rifle, checking the mechanism with practiced efficiency. Question is whether we meet it standing tall or crawling. Chayton observed him load the weapon, and something shifted in his expression. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. You fight for me? I fight for what's just. Been too long since. I did that. Yet even as Jake spoke those words, he wondered if righteousness would suffice when the violence began. 6 men outside, possibly more coming, and all he possessed was an aging rifle and a wounded boy who couldn't stand without assistance. Then Chayton did something that chilled Jake's soul. The boy approached the window and made a sound low and haunting, like a desert owl calling its mate. 3 times he produced the sound, then listened. From somewhere in the darkness beyond the cabin, an identical call responded. What was that? Jake demanded. Chayton met his gaze, and for the first time since their meeting, the boy smiled. My father approaches. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. Your father? Chayton nodded, pressing his hand against his wounded. Sighed. War Chief Dakota of the Stone River Band. I am his youngest son. The magnitude of that revelation struck Jake like a hammer blow. He wasn't merely sheltering any Apache child. He was protecting the son of one of the most feared war leaders in the territory. Man whose name was whispered around campfires with the same reverence reserved for natural catastrophes. Sweet Jesus, Jake breathed. How many warriors does? Your father commands sufficient? The night had fallen completely silent. Even the usual sounds of insects and nocturnal creatures had ceased, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Jake moved to the window and peered out, seeing nothing except darkness and shadows that could have concealed an entire army. Did you become separated from them? Chayton's jaw tightened. Was hunting alone. Wished to prove myself as warrior. Discovered white men stealing horses from our people. Tempted to stop them. He touched his wounded side. They possessed guns. I carried only blade. Those horses belonged to your people. Belonged to my cousin's widow. He was killed last winter by blue soldiers. Horses were all his family possessed. Boone understood now. This wasn't simply about a wounded child. This concerned theft, murder, and a father who'd already suffered too much loss. Men like War Chief Dakota didn't negotiate when their children were threatened. They came with war paint and steel, prepared to burn everything in their path. The sound of approaching riders made them both tense, but these weren't the same horses as before. These moved differently, quieter, like shadows given substance. Jake counted at least 25 sets of hoofbeats, maybe more, encircling his property in a wide perimeter. They arrived, Chayton whispered. Through the window, Jake caught glimpses of movement in the darkness. Warriors on horseback painted for battle, moving with the lethal precision of men who'd spent their existence fighting for survival. They didn't approach the cabin directly. Instead, they assumed positions in the rocks and brush, creating a perfect circle of death around anyone trapped within. A new voice called from the darkness, speaking in Apache. Chayton responded, his voice stronger now, carrying across the night like a son calling to his father. The exchange was brief, but Jake didn't need to comprehend the words to hear the relief in both voices. War Chief Dakota emerged at the edge of the lamplight, alone and on foot. He appeared older than Jake had anticipated, perhaps. 55, with silver threading his long black hair and scars that narrated countless battles. But his eyes burned with an intensity that made Jake's skin crawl. "White man," the chief said in flawless English, "you shield my son. I did what any honorable man would do. Honorable men are scarce." Dakota stepped closer, studying Jake's face in the dim light. "You could have surrendered him to the men hunting him. Would have been safer for you. Some principles matter more than safety." The chief nodded slowly, as if this response satisfied some test Jake hadn't realized he was taking. "The men who wounded my son? They remain here?" 6 of them, possibly more by now, are watching the cabin, waiting for dawn. Something dangerous flickered in Dakota's eyes. "Then we shall not make them wait long." Jake raised his hand. "I appreciate your thinking, but if you attack those men on my land, every soldier in the territory will come hunting you, and they'll destroy every Apache settlement they can locate." Dakota's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. The predator remained, coiled and ready to strike, but he was listening. "You have another solution, white man?" "Perhaps. Depends on what those men truly want." Jake looked out at the darkness where he knew the Garrett brothers were hiding. "They came for your son, but they aren't soldiers. They're thieves and bullies who thought they'd found easy prey. You believe they will flee when they see my warriors? Think they'll soil themselves and beg for mercy." Jake turned back to the chief. "But if we kill them, their deaths will be blamed on Apache raiders. More innocent people will die in the revenge that follows." Chayton spoke up from his position by the window, his young voice cutting through the tension. "Father, this man preserved my life, heed his counsel." War Chief Dakota studied his son, noting the carefully bandaged wound and the trust in the boy's eyes. When he looked back at Jake, something had changed. "What do you propose? We wait for dawn. Let them see exactly what they're confronting. Give them opportunity to ride away and never return." Jake paused. "But we do it on our terms. Make them come to us. And if they choose to fight?" Jake met the chief's gaze steadily. "Then we end it. But we offer them the choice first." What happened next would have been impossible to believe if Jake hadn't witnessed it personally. Without a word or visible signal from their chief, the Apache warriors began to relocate. It's not retreating, but repositioning themselves with the fluid precision of a wolf pack. They dispersed through the rocks and brush, creating overlapping fields. A fire while remaining completely invisible to anyone observing from ground level. "Your men are well disciplined," Jake observed. "They are my sons and brothers. They have been fighting for their lives since they could walk." Dakota moved to the window beside Chayton, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "How severe is his injury?" "Clean, painful, but not life-threatening if we maintain it properly." Jake watched the interaction between father and son, seeing a tenderness that completely contradicted the chief's fearsome reputation. "He's courageous, Didn't make a sound when I cleaned it. He is young, still believes pain is something too. Be conquered rather than endured. Takoda's voice carried the weight of hard experience. Life will teach him otherwise. As the hours passed, Jake found himself in the strangest conversation of his life. Here he sat in his own cabin with one of the most wanted men in the territory, discussing everything from horse breeding to the changes white settlement had brought to the land. The chief spoke with an intelligence and insight that shattered every stereotype Jake had ever heard about Apache savages. "You are not what I expected," Tokudes said, as the first pale hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon. "Neither are you." "What did you expect?" Jake thought carefully before answering. "A killer. A man who'd cut my throat for helping his enemies." "Am a killer, but I kill only those who threaten my people." The chief's eyes hardened slightly. "Your people have given me much practice." Before Jake could respond, a shout came from outside. Silas Garrett's voice, rough with cold and anger from a night spent watching an empty cabin. "Morrison, sun's rising, and our patience is exhausted. Time to settle this once and for all." Takoda smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Jake had ever seen. "Yes," the chief said quietly. "It is time." Jake stepped onto his porch as the first rays of sunlight painted the valley gold. Silas Garrett sat his horse 40 yards away, flanked by his brother Lucas and 4 other men who looked like they'd spent the night drinking courage from a bottle. Their eyes were bloodshot and vicious, the kind of desperate meanness that came from men who knew they were outmatched but couldn't retreat without losing face. "Morning, Garrett," Jake called out, his rifle held casually in the crook of his arm. "You boys look exhausted. Rough night?" "Long enough," Silas snarled. "We know that Apache Brad is in there, Morrison. This is your final chance to hand him over before we come in and take him ourselves, is that so?" Jake took a step forward, letting his boots ring against the wooden planks. "And what exactly do you intend to do with a wounded child?" "That ain't your business." Lucas Garrett spat into the dirt, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Apache killed my nephew last spring. Time for some payback." "Your nephew was smuggling weapons to Mexican bandits," Jake said evenly. "Got himself shot trying to cheat the wrong people. Had nothing to do with Apache." Truth found its mark. Lucas's face flushed crimson, and his hand tightened on his weapon. But before he could draw, his brother raised a hand. "Enough talk," Silas said. "You have 10 seconds to produce that boy, or we're coming and shooting." Jake smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Well, now that's interesting, because I was just thinking the same thing." He raised his voice so every word carried across the morning air. "War Chief Tokuda, I believe these gentlemen would like to meet you." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as 6 white men slowly realized they'd walked into something far worse than they had imagined. The Apache warriors rose from the rocks and brushed like spirits taking solid form. Not all at once, but in a coordinated revelation that lasted exactly 15 heartbeats. First one, then another, then groups of 3 and 4, until the entire landscape seemed alive with painted faces and steel weapons. 40 warriors, perhaps more. Everyone painted for war, everyone armed with rifles that had been taken from soldiers who no longer needed them. They didn't move or speak. They simply existed, like death itself made manifest in the morning light. Silas Garrett went pale as bleached bone. His horse sensed his terror and began to prance nervously, adding to the chaos building in the man's mind. Beside him, Lucas was counting under his breath, his voice growing higher with each number. "Sweet Mary." One of the other men whispered, "Sweet Mary, Mother of God." War Chief Dakota stepped out of Jake's cabin, moving with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle and on the hunt. He wore traditional Apache clothing decorated with silver and turquoise, but the rifle in his hands was modern and well-maintained. When he spoke, his voice carried the absolute authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You hunt my son like a beast," he said simply. "Shoot him when he tries to recover what was stolen from his family. Now you come to this good man's home with threats and violence." The chief's eyes moved from one mounted man to the next, cataloging faces and weapons with the practiced assessment of a predator selecting prey. "I am curious," Tokuda continued. What did you plan to do with my boy once you caught him, Silas? Garrett tried to speak, but only a strangled croak emerged. His brother Lucas was openly trembling now, his horse dancing sideways as it sensed its rider's terror. The four other men looked like they were seriously considering abandoning their mounts and fleeing on foot. I asked you a question, War Chief Tokuda said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. What were your plans for my son? We just wanted ... Silas finally found his voice, but it came out high and thin. Justice for what his people done to ours. Justice. The chief repeated the word like he was tasting something bitter. You steal our horses. Shoot my boy when he tries to stop you. Chase him onto this man's land with guns and rope. He paused, letting the implications sink in. This is your justice? Jake watched the confrontation unfold, marveling at how completely the tables had turned. 12 hours ago, these 6 men had felt comfortable threatening him in his own home. Now they sat surrounded by enough firepower to obliterate a small town, facing a war chief whose reputation for ruthlessness was legendary throughout the territory. Chief Lucas Garrett spoke up, his voice cracking like an adolescent's. We didn't know about the boy being your son. I mean, if we'd known, ... to you, would have what? Left him to bleed to death alone. Dakota's expression showed exactly what he thought of that excuse. Or perhaps he would have demanded a higher price for his return. One of the unnamed men suddenly broke. This is madness, he shouted, wheeling his horse toward the gap between 2 warriors. I ain't dying for somebody else's fight. He spurred his horse into a desperate gallop, heading for what appeared to be open ground between the Apache positions. He made it exactly 60 yards before 3 arrows sprouted from his back like deadly flowers. He tumbled from his saddle and lay motionless in the dust. The remaining 5 men stared at their companion's corpse. The reality of their situation finally penetrating their minds. They were surrounded by professional killers who could drop them all before they could clear leather. Anyone else feeling like a ride? Jake asked conversationally. Silas Garrett was sweating despite the cool morning air. What do you want? Money? We have money. Want my horses returned, War Chief Tokuda said simply. The ones you stole from my daughter's family. We don't have them anymore, Lucas said quickly. Sold them in Phoenix 4 days ago. Then you will retrieve them today. That's impossible. They could be anywhere by now. Then you will locate them. You will return them, along with compensation for the pain you caused my son and the trouble you brought to my friend here. The chief's eyes flicked to Jake. 60 head of cattle should cover the debt. 60 head. Silas exploded. That's highway robbery. War Chief Tokuda smiled, and every warrior within sight shifted slightly, fingers moving closer to triggers. No, the chief said softly. Highway robbery is what you did to my people. This is justice. The standoff stretched like a bowstring, ready to snap. Jake could see the calculations running through Silas's mind, weighing greed against survival. The man was a bully and a thief, but he wasn't completely stupid. If we do this, Silas said finally, if we get your horses back and pay the cattle, what then? Then you leave this territory and never return. You find somewhere else to practice your particular brand of justice. The chief's voice hardened, because if I see any of you again, I will assume you have come back to finish what you started here today. Can't just run us off our own. Land, your land? Tokuda laughed, but there was no humor in it. This was Apache land when your grandfathers were still learning to walk. We are simply renegotiating the lease terms. Chaitan appeared in the doorway behind his father, still pale from his wound, but standing straight and proud. When he spoke, his young voice carried clearly across the yard. Father, let me tell them what happens to horse thieves in the old ways. War Chief Tokuda held up a hand, silencing his son with a gentle but firm gesture. No need for old ways today, my son. These men understand their situation clearly enough. Silas Garrett looked at the boy, then back at the chief, and something finally broke inside him. Fight went out of his shoulders like air from a punctured bladder. How long do we have? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. 7 days to return the horses. 14 days to deliver the cattle to the place I will show you. Tokuda pointed toward a distant ridge. There's a box canyon beyond those rocks. You will leave him there and ride away. No tricks, no attempts. To follow my people back to our camp, and if we can't find all the horses, then you will replace them with animals of equal value. My son will help you identify what is acceptable." The chief's smile was sharp as broken glass. He has become quite expert at judging horse flesh since yesterday. Lucas Garrett finally found his voice. "What about Clarence?" He gestured toward their dead companion. "Buzzards need to eat too," Jake said flatly. "I suppose you can take him with you if you've got strong stomachs and weak noses." The 4 surviving men dismounted and awkwardly loaded their companion's body across his saddle. The process took several minutes, during which 40 Apache warriors watched them with the patient intensity of cats watching mice. No one spoke. No one needed. 2. When they were mounted again, War Chief Dakota stepped forward. "One more thing. The man who protected my son." He looked directly at Jake. "You will not be bothered by these men or their friends again. Ever. This I promise you." Silas started to object, but the chief's raised hand stopped him cold. "You have a choice. Accept my protection of this man as part of our agreement, or we can settle this matter in the traditional way right now." The horse thieves looked around at the circle of warriors, at the arrows already nocked and the rifles already aimed. It made the only choice available to reasonable men who wanted to see another sunset. "We accept," Silas said through gritted teeth. "Good. Now go. You have much work to do and very little time to do it." The 4 men rode away without another word, leading the horse that carried their dead friend. They moved slowly, like men carrying a great weight that had nothing to do with the body draped across the extra saddle. Jake watched them disappear over the ridge, then turned to find War Chief Dakota, studying him with curious eyes. "Why?" Chief asked simply. "Why what? Why risk everything for a boy you had never seen before?" Jake thought about it for a long moment. Watching Chayton lean against the doorframe, young, but somehow older than he'd been yesterday morning. "Because somebody had to, and I was there." Dakota nodded slowly, as if this answer explained everything he needed to know about the white rancher who lived alone in the hidden valley.
Ow.
"You will always have friends among my people," the chief said. "If you ever need help, make the desert owl call my son taught you. Someone will answer. I hope I never need to take you up on that. Hope is good, but preparation is better." The chief mounted his horse with fluid grace. "My son speaks well of you, says you fight for what is right, not what is easy. Your son's got good instincts. He'll make a fine warrior someday. Yes, but first, he must learn that courage without wisdom is just another way to die young." Dakota looked down at Chayton. "Come, my son, your mother worries." The boy approached Jake and extended his small hand. When Jake shook it, Chayton's grip was firm and sure. "Thank you," the boy said simply, "for everything." "Just remember what happened here," Jake replied. "Sometimes the right choice is the hardest one to make." Within minutes, the Apache warriors had vanished as silently as they'd appeared, leaving no trace except hoofprints that the wind would soon erase. Jake stood alone in his yard, watching the empty landscape and marveling at how quickly the world could change. The horses were returned within 6 days. The cattle were delivered in 13. Silas and Lucas Garrett were never seen in the territory again, though rumors placed them in Oregon, working honest jobs for the first time in their lives. Jake continued ranching in his hidden valley, but he was never quite alone again. Sometimes on quiet nights he would hear the call of a desert owl that sounded almost like a boy's voice, and he would smile and return to whatever he'd been doing, because he knew that somewhere in the vast wilderness, Chayton was growing into the kind of man his father could be proud of. And that was worth more than all the silver in Nevada if you enjoyed this tale of courage and unexpected alliance. Please consider subscribing to our channel and leaving a super chat to help us share more stories from the American frontier. Support means everything to us. Click the video on your screen to watch another incredible story from the Old West.